So welcome. I'm excited to do this presentation today because we're looking at the power of peers. And peers are so important in the learning of our students, but really for all students. Peers are important for each other and their learning, not only their academic learning, but their communication as well. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at planning for peer support arrangements, which is one of the strategies we use for the Peer Support Network project. And we're going to look at how to include the core vocabulary in the planning for communication within the peer support arrangements. And that is what we tend to do with the TAALC project. And these two projects go so well hand in hand. So I'm excited for this today. Because we have both TAALC participants who may not have had any exposure to peer supports, and then our peer support people that may not have had a lot with core vocabulary, we're going to do some introduction, more so on peer supports, but also a little introduction on what core is as well. So we're going to look at what the data tells us about the social and communication opportunities of students with significant disabilities. We'll look at what the Peer Support Network project is, and then we'll get specific to peer support arrangements, which we'll describe, and how to plan for that as well as communication. And then we'll have questions at the end. So first off, just looking at the data, what does the data tell us about students and the development of peer relationships and friendships? There was a longitudinal study done, I think it's initially in 2002 and again in 2012, and they asked parents and students about their social interactions and friendships. And this one is about students with autism, but we also have very similar data for students with intellectual disabilities, similar data for students with multiple disabilities. But when asked about seeing friends outside of school, only 6%, so the six little red figures in the bottom, frequently see friends outside of school. So that means the other 94%, maybe sometimes, maybe probably rarely see friends outside of school. 84%, well, most of these blue figures rarely or never received phone calls from friends. And I think one of the things we really need to work hard on at school is 50% have never been invited to another youth social activity in the past year. So they haven't been invited, half of these kids, to a birthday party, to a football game, to any other activity outside of school. And that's kind of the things we want to see improve on with the peer support project, as well as increasing communication. That's going to help with that considerably. So we have lots of data from Eric Carter. In one of his studies, he looked at the interactions for students with significant disabilities. And in his initial observation, there were lots of interactions. And, you know, you can look at these students, Aaron and Jennifer, 75% of the time they were involved in interactions. The other students, you can see 68%, 58%. Sam was down at 24%, but they did have interactions. But once he looked at the types of interactions, it turned out that only a very small percentage of those interactions were actually with their peers. So for Aaron and Jennifer and Adam, it was 5–6% of the time with peers. The rest is with adults. When you go over to Sam, although he didn't have many interactions, majority of his were with his peers, which was nice. And then 2 students, no interactions with peers, none. So that's some of the things we really are working to change. Then when we looked at another study, we looked at how many interactions typical kids have in a class period in an hour versus how many interactions a student with a significant disability has. And you can see there's a significant difference. Peers have 97% of the time they are involved in some type of an interaction, but students with disabilities only 14% of the time. I also looked at the percentage of time students are within proximity, direct proximity of an adult. And peers, it was 0% of the time of the class period were they in direct proximity of adults. But students with significant disabilities, 50% of the time. And that's where we tend to lose out on our opportunities for interactions with their peers, because whenever there's an adult around, forms this bubble and keeps us from interacting with our peers. So when we are thinking about that, there are some important elements for inclusion to ensure that kids have opportunities to interact. First one is shared activities, that students are in the same place at the same time doing the same things. These are also important elements for opportunities for communication. We need to be at the same place at the same time doing the same things so we have common things to talk about. Proximity to peers. We need to be near our peers if we're going to have the opportunity to communicate with them and develop relationships with them. Reliable communication, of course, that's kind of our underlying premise here. Informed peers. Our peers need to understand how our students communicate. And if they have some idiosyncratic behaviors or different ways of communicating, gestures and things, then our peers need to understand what that is in order to communicate with students and to use their communication systems as well. And the last one, just enough support, and that really is to us. We need to provide just enough support, but also know when to stay out of the way and stay back and just facilitate the learning. So in thinking about that and thinking about inclusion and opportunities for communication, location matters. It matters tremendously. But supports might matter more, because even if our students are in an inclusive setting, if they are not included in the same activities and the same learning as the other students, is it really inclusion? If nobody else in the class is actually talking to them, is it really inclusion? So location matters, but if we don't have supports in place, so the students are engaged and have ways to communicate, they're still not really included. So with that said, that's kind of our background information. We're going to look at some peer-mediated strategies that we use in peer support networks and communication strategies we use with TAALC. Any questions so far? Comments? Okay. For those of you that haven't been to a peer support training, we typically we train on two peer-mediated interventions. We do peer networks and peer support arrangements. Today we're primarily going to talk about peer support arrangements, but I did want to let you know about both strategies. Peer networks are strictly a social network, a social group of 3 to 6 peers established around a student with significant disability, and they're kind of a group created to look at socially for fun to develop friendships. And our other intervention, the one we'll talk the most about today, is peer support arrangements. And in peer support arrangements, this occurs in an inclusive classroom. So it's one or more peers together working as kind of like this community of learners, supporting each other throughout the activities within an academic class or a general ed class. So what is a peer support arrangement? It's one or more peers without a disability working together with their classmates with a disability as a community of learners. And what makes this different from, say, like peer tutors is that these kids are in there together to learn the same content. They're members of the class. Nobody is assigned as the person to help this person. We're a group helping each other and supporting each other. And some of the ways kids support each other is we encourage, they encourage each other, they provide feedback to each other, Hopefully we model communication. That might be a little more specific to aided language modeling and things we want to provide our student. We also can help promote interaction with other classmates. So if I'm interacting with someone and I have some friend that comes along, I'm going to introduce them, and we'll kind of make our social circle grow. So the makeup of a peer support arrangement, of course, is what we typically call a focus student, and that's the student with significant disability. And then their peers, their peer partners, paraprofessionals. And we have the paraprofessional because typically, in a lot of cases, students might have a paraprofessional assigned to them, or a paraprofessional accompanies students to their general ed class. And so we look at paraprofessionals as our facilitators in this case. And we have our general ed teacher. A lot of times the general ed teacher may be the facilitator themselves. If it's a collaborating special educator, they may be a facilitator in the classroom. And then we have our related service providers, or SLPs, and others who may also be in the classroom and helping to facilitate. But the other part with the adults in this picture is the team that is needed to plan this out well, to make sure peer support arrangements are successful, and to plan out the communication supports a student needs to ensure that those are well planned and taught within the setting. In order to set up a peer support arrangement, there's basically 7 steps. Of course, you have to identify the student with a disability who requires supports to participate in the general ed classroom. In this case, we're also thinking about students with complex communication needs who we want to participate in general ed classes. So you have to identify the classes they're in. So right now, if you don't have any students in a general ed class, you want to think about what are some good classes that they can participate in based on interest, based on need, based on, we need to be able to learn literacy, we need number sense, those types of things. So in thinking about next year, starting to plan for next year, think about some potential classes students might be included in. You also need to identify then those adult team members that have to help plan this out. And then you think about, and this, we're not going to go into the steps of how you do all of this. I'm just going over what the steps are. But then you'll have to recruit peers from within those classes for peer support arrangements, 2, maybe 3 peers that would sit near your student and help support your student, and your student could help support them. Number 5 is create the individualized peer support plan, and that's what we're going to focus on in this webinar today. We're going to focus in on step 5, creating that individualized peer support plan. That is a piece that is extremely important, but also a piece that we notice is not done often, and then people struggle a lot with making the peer support arrangements successful or the communication systems successful. So creating these plans gives you a nice guide on how we are then going to teach our students. There's another step, we're not going to go into it today, but orienting the peers to their role. So what does it mean to be part of a peer support arrangement? What does it mean for me to support my friend sitting next to me, or for me to receive support from my friend? But also being informed about each other, understanding how each of us learn, how each of us communicate, helps us to understand how we can support each other. So that's an important piece as well. And then finally, we look at shifting the practices of paraprofessionals. If paraprofessionals accompany students to their inclusive class, we want to start to shift their roles from being that direct one-on-one support, sitting right next to the student, and getting them to start stepping back and facilitating the students supporting each other and facilitating and encouraging the interactions. Any questions on peer support arrangements? The basic steps. All right, well, we're going to jump right into creating those individualized peer support plans, because again, that's the most important step. And up front, at first, when you start, it's really important to go through this process and use these plans and think it through. And once you get rolling, once you've gone through this process a few times and you've got the ball rolling, you may not have to do this in detail as often, but to get it started and to kind of develop your own motor planning in implementing this, it's really important to go through the process in a more formal way. One of the planning approaches is more like a pre-planning approach, and I really like this to think about up front. And that is to go into whatever classroom your student is included in and look at and discover how peers interact with one another and how they participate in class in all aspects of what goes on in class, because we have different types of communication and interactions that we do throughout a class period depending on what the activity is and what the classroom rules are. So at the beginning of class, are we allowed to just talk to each other, or do we have to get quiet and get busy on some board work? During lectures, are we allowed to talk, or do we have to just take notes? So looking at and seeing how peers are allowed to interact throughout a class is really important, because that helps us figure out then how our students can or maybe shouldn't interact with their peers in certain activities. The other thing you want to look at is, what do peers say to each other? You know, what are the comments they make? Because they're different from the comments that I probably used when I was in high school. So it's good to keep up with how do kids talk to each other nowadays and what are they talking about? Because once we know that, we can then start to focus on how can our student participate in these interactions with their peers? What do they need in their communication system to do so? And then we can look at how can either the teacher or the paraprofessional help facilitate that. And we do it for each piece of the class period for what goes on. And here's an example. And I like this example in, you know, you look at coming into class and what you can do. You greet each other. But we also get out our materials and get ready so we can remind each other. So if I come into class and you haven't gotten your materials out and we're supposed to be doing something, I can remind you, hey, don't forget, you need to be on page 12. So kids that are in the peer support arrangement can support each other in that way. But I like when you look about free time and breaks down towards the bottom, kids chat about TV shows. You know, what are the popular shows nowadays for kids? It's probably different than the ones that their parents are watching. What are their plans for after school? Or they share jokes, or they tease each other, and that's where some of the commenting and how they interact is really important to know when we're setting up communication systems for kids. Any thoughts on the pre-planning approach? Anybody have any strategies they use?
I know that Gina has a lot of peers coming into the classroom, and then I think they go to 2 different science and social studies. Some of the kids do.
Okay.
With the peers, but I do not see any interactions like what you're talking about, which would be nice.
Okay, so that
with other typical students in the class when they walk in.
Right. So that's why I do believe the planning part is so important, but planning it out and then making sure you implement when you go in to facilitate that some of these interactions can occur. So we look at this pre-planning, and in looking at how peers interact and how our students can interact, well, we know with talk, we've done a lot with core. So we know kids can use their core boards to start to interact with their peers. But what are some of the other things they might need to go back to making any of these types of comments? And I'm pointing to the screen in case you can't tell.
Well, there probably has to be some fringe or nouns.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Jane Kleinert is shaking her head. Yes, we need some nouns.
Yep. Fringe for sure. Comments, being able to make comments, those other additional things along with our
popcorn. We need popcorn.
We need popcorn.
Two, they need more greetings so they can like say hello to their friends or what's up or whatever that they want to say or how they want to say it. But
mm-hmm. Right. And that's why I really like the planning sheets, because they really help you think that out. It helps come up with vocabulary to include, which I always found so hard to think about when I was teaching.
Luann, could you put that sheet back up that you just had there?
Mm-hmm.
So do you go ahead on here and put the vocabulary that you want?
I could do it on this sheet.
I was just curious how you do it.
Mm-hmm. This one, I really focus when I think about this one, and I'll be honest with you, I haven't used it. Whoops. I really think about it in this column.
Okay.
Really looking at how the peers interact and what they say, and I would jot down things I hear them say if I don't have it on a core board or on a commenting fringe already. I would jot those down and look at what I have and say, maybe that's what I say, not what kids say, and update.
So could you go back one? Yeah, to that one. The first one, oh, there it is. Make sure he has his device close to him and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I've never done this, so I'm just asking. Have you like already taught the peers to use the device? Because
yes.
It says like, so they already know all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. That is one of the steps. So
okay.
We may use this planning approach up front with just the adults, but once we're ready to implement, we will have an orientation meeting with the peers and teach them about each other. And so we may or may not have the student present, depending. I think I would ask the student if they wanted to be there when we talked about how they communicate.
Yeah.
I did see a nice video today on the Bridge School where the students were introducing themselves. So each student made like a little PowerPoint about who they are. And so one young lady had a PowerPoint. She had a head switch for her communication device. And she had designed her pre-programmed messages with pictures with what she wanted to say. Sorry, I have a cat bothering me. And so that's how the kids learned about her system, because she was presenting about herself using her communication system that had her head switch. There was a lot of wait time. So those of you with TAALC, we've talked a lot about wait time for students to not only process what they're hearing and saying, but also the motor time and energy that they need to activate their system. So it was really, I thought that was a really good way to do the orientation meeting.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
This is Sarah. Do you have any guidance in terms of doing this in terms of like parent permissions that you get before doing like an orientation meeting or something like that? Because like I've done like general lessons in general ed classrooms on like disabilities in general and like how we can be good friends and things like that. But then always very careful to stay broad and not student specific because of confidentiality issues. So like, do you have any thoughts on that or how you handle that?
For our project specific, we do have parent permissions. But for just general class implementation, I would speak with the parent because you are maybe doing a little more specific about how kids learn and about their system. But in general, it's important for peers to understand that anyway. I mean, even with doing things like aided language modeling and peers partner-assisted scanning, Jackie or Harold, do you see a need for parent permission in having
Well, for both for our project, we've looked primarily at parent permission for kids to be in peer support networks, but obviously this, and I'm thinking about our permission form that we send out to both parents of students with and without disabilities, and it does describe what the arrangement is. It asks for them to sign to be involved. We don't collect that information, but we give it to districts and suggest that they need to let parents know about this, that this is what it involves. This is the training that kids will get, and that part of this training, in addition to these specific strategies for prompting social and communication. You know, as one person very eloquently said, just because kids go to the science class doesn't mean they have interactions. These are the ways, the strategies to get those interactions. But in order to really train peers, making sure that parents have given their permission, in order to do that. It's you stay away. You don't get to the level of like, here's Johnny's IEP objectives, for example, and you don't share. But you could share. Well, he's working on, on responding to questions with the augmented communication system. Here are ways to make sure you get you have his attention. Those sorts of things. So it is, Sarah, student specific, but it is not disclosing you're not disclosing truly confidential information, and what information you're disclosing you should get from parents. I'll look it up and get out to Luann the parent permission form we have, so that
would be great.
Yeah, I do have the parent permission forms.
Okay.
The other thing I would probably do, and you all can correct me if you think this is not correct, but if I have students who are included, who I'm, are going to be in some inclusive classrooms, during the IEP meeting when we discuss that, I would probably bring up, since they're in this inclusive classroom, we want them to interact, we want them to be involved in discussions going on in the classroom, and in order to do so, or in order to ensure our students have opportunities, their peers are also going to have to understand how they're communicating and how to communicate with them. So I think it's also really good to talk about in an IEP meeting.
Yeah.
Another possible strategy would be to think about social etiquette in individuals with disabilities. So you could do some very generic, but it may be specific in your case, how to use the device if a student is using a speech generating device, how to interact with a student who uses a wheelchair, how to some of those disability etiquette kinds of things that you're really not talking about a specific student, but you are talking about some generic things that will help kids feel more comfortable in that interaction. I think those kinds of things might be really helpful. And then you can drop in a few things like, well, our friend uses this kind of device, and here's how you use it, and get the kid who uses the device to show their friend how it works. And then if the kid is showing his friend or his new friend how to use it, then it's not necessarily as much of a conflict of interest, I don't think.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking. If they have a system and they're out amongst others with the system, it's not like breaking confidentiality to talk about them using the system. I don't know. Well, any other comments or questions in regards to that? All right, I'm going to move on to the classroom support planning form.
Can I just say, Luann, Luann's going to show 3 different planning forms. Whatever you do, don't do all 3 of them. Don't even do 2. I would not even do 2 of them. It's which one seems to make the most sense for your student. The first one we just showed you is wonderful for facilitating communication and social interactions.
Sorry, I'm going the wrong way.
And the second and third get more into some of the things required, not just for social interactions, but some of the things for more academic engagement.
Yeah, and that's why I really like this one as a pre-planning, to really think about how peers actually interact and what they say and when they are allowed to say it is really important. But for real down and dirty planning, that's where these two forms come in. The classroom planning form really looks at the instruction, really planning out well classroom instruction, and you know, the standards that inform the instruction. What is the content? What are the activities that are going to occur for that content? And then how are we going to know if the student has learned the content? What are the expectations that the general educator holds for all students in the class? And that kind of goes back some to the pre-planning. So within the activities, what are the expectations? When are they allowed to interact? When do they have to do things on their own? But also, what are the expectations in showing what they know and can do in terms of the content that is being taught? Because that's where the supports are going to come in place. You know, our kids are in there, that location is important, but if we don't have supports in place, it's going to be much harder for the student to interact and learn in that environment. You know, along with planning, you'll think about the IEP goals that you can work on in that classroom activity environment, and also the communication goals that they might work on. And then how the student will be supported to actively participate in the activities with the materials. But during the classroom planning, we look at all the different aspects. So we know sometimes there's lecture and whole group instruction. Sometimes there's small group interactions and partner work. There's independent work. I like the fact in the sheet that they include things like homework and assessment, so that we can ensure we've looked at and made supports to all the pieces that we need to, so that the student can interact with not only their peers but also the materials and activities. And then you look at what goes on in each piece of the classroom day. So what goes on during lectures? What are the typical activities and things the kids are doing? We sort of looked at that when we were looking at how peers communicate with each other. But now we're looking at what is the teacher's typical activities and expectations for the kids. And with that, then what supports do they need? And to me, this is what typical planning is all about. This is an example of the classroom planning form that we use. And then we're going to look at in a minute a video of a team working through this form. But as you can see, we might look at watching documentaries. It's the third one down on the whole class instruction. So students, expectations for all students is that they'll complete some guided notes created by the teacher, and then they'll have some discussion. So what are the supports we need for our student? Our student will have some guided notes adapted that stress the main concept or the big idea, and the student will could highlight in those notes. Maybe the student is going to fill in the salient information, the fringe vocabulary into their notes, and then review with their peers what they just watched in the documentary. So it really helps think about how they'll fit and interact in each piece. So let's look at this team. This is about a 3-minute video, but listen to the team problem solve and think about what happens in the gen ed class. I believe this is a science class.
And so for small group instruction, you always do, like, you develop a question, and then it's always discovery based.
And then if they're having trouble discovering it on their own, I go to that group and do some small group direct instruction. Okay.
That's what I thought. But I think, okay, so let's do discovery base. And your expectation is that they're working together
They're working together They're showing respect to each other. They're with their group.
So our modifications for her.
How does the discovery group work? What are they using to
Well, for example, they have a question, like right now we're on water purification and filtration. So they have dirt. I have a jug full of dirty water. You build a water filter, and if it comes out clear, we're good. If it doesn't come out clear, we have to modify it. And so they usually look up, research, sometimes watch some videos, or they discuss what they already know about filtering the water. And then they build it. You have junk, and they go find stuff, and they build a filter, and they test it.
Okay, so I'm gonna go with this one. So for like watching a video, how will your student get information out of the video? I mean, is listening and listening comprehension
Fairly, yeah. That's probably one of her higher things. And if it's a video, she comprehends it better than if it's you or I speaking or saying it. So.
Okay. And how about your students? Do they have any formal note-taking guides they use or anything when they watch videos or when they research on? Do they research like on the computer? Or
They will research. Some will do the Cornell notes. They're allowed to take it on paper, or they can do it in a Google document. And their notes are based on what's best for them. So if they need to write something down, or if they need to draw a picture, or if they need to just make a note where to look at it, they will. And then their notes, I mean, like if I have a PowerPoint note, they'll have the PowerPoint as well. And then most of the time, instead of standing up there lecturing, you copy this down. We'll go through it. They can go through it together. They discuss it. What do you need from this, and what does all this mean? Summarize it up. So it's a lot of discussion and talking, and then writing what they need.
So anyway, what I started to say was, as they were discussing the activities the students are involved in, the discovery, this is the small group activity, it's discovery. Thinking about the details, what does it mean to do discovery? Is that a research? Is it reading? In this case, it was watching some videos, or being posed a problem and kind of having to experiment to solve the problem and figure out how to clean the dirty water. So some of those types of discussions are important to have to understand the different expectations for the students so that you can then figure out, all right, how are students going to discuss? How are they going to interact during the discovery piece of problem solving? At the very end of the video, the general ed teacher said the students will be involved in discussions, talking, and writing, I think she said. So those are the things when we're looking at using the planning form, we need to think about how are our students going to discuss, to talk, to write. I really like that video. And here is just a picture of their classroom planning form as they were working through it. There was an earlier part of their discussion where when they start a new unit, they have vocabulary, and all the kids in the class, they get the vocabulary word, they find a picture to go with it, and they get a definition. So that is just ideal for finding our fringe vocabulary for the unit. And then they went on to discuss how the student would be more and more involved. So I just wanted to show that. And that is the planning piece we use for peer supports. We kind of do a planning set we use with the TAALC project, the SET framework, where we look at the student and how does the student communicate, and what about the student do we need to consider when designing communication systems. What are the environments the student is in? So what classes, what are they included in? What are the tasks they're doing? Same thing we're looking at in the peer support planning form. And what are the tools they need? So we'll just look real quick at a set framework, because this is another way to consider how the student will be involved in their peer support arrangement and in their classes. So in this, again, the first part of SET stands for the student. So what are the characteristics of the student in relation to their communication? So we look at what forms they currently have and use, what messages they currently, that's the communicative intent, the messages they are communicating, their preferences, so we can keep our students motivated and engaged. And then if there are any motor or vision or hearing aspects of the student that might influence what we do with the communication system. Then you look at the environments the student is in, and so academics, which is where we're looking at peer support arrangements, the tasks that student has to do, and we know in this particular class we just saw in the video, they're going to have to discuss and talk and do some writing and problem solving. And then, so how is the student going to do that? Well, in an academic class for this student, the GoTalk, an electronic device, works well for answering questions. But you also need that topic-specific fringe, as well as numbers and letters for the particular activities they're working on. But you'll notice when we go down the tools, they vary depending on the task or the environment the student is in. And that's why we talk a lot about students needing a multimodal system, because a core board in a busy, loud, messy lunchroom, you know, a low-tech paper-based core board is a lot easier to deal with than an electronic device in that type of a setting. So we want to make sure we have flexible and multimodal systems for our students.
There's somebody.
So any questions on those two planning forms or any comments anybody want to add? Okay, then this last one, and it's going to be a lot quicker, is the peer support planning form. And this really looks at getting into that peer support arrangement. And those peers, you know, we had the visual of the focus student and his two peers and the gen ed teacher. These three kids, the focus student and their two peers, what are they going to do throughout all of this planning we just did? So at the beginning of class, the focus student can say hi to their peers. They can get out their materials and get busy on the board work. Their peers can also greet their friend. If the focus student comes in and doesn't get out their materials, their peers can remind them, hey, don't forget, you need to get busy on the board work, or here's the paper you need for your board work. And the facilitator can help remind the peers how to interact with each other. So if a focus student comes in and is running late, the facilitator might ask the peer partner, can you share your notes with your friend? But this is that planning of how the peers will interact with each other within the activities we've planned out already. So we'll look at, I think I have animation in here, so I'm going to pass through that and look at the example. So here is an example of a student that's in an earth science class, I think. And this is small group or lab activity. And so you think about, okay, Stephen, our focus student, he's got to listen and follow the directions. He can ask questions to his peers who are sitting next to him, and he can record the things he needs to in his planner. I like in what the peers could do. The peers could use Stephen's communication system when conversing with him. They can provide Stephen with choices about which aspects of the activity he wants to take the lead on, or which aspects of the activities that he wants others to help him with, or whatever. And then the facilitator can redirect. If Stephen comes for help to the facilitator can say, well, why don't you ask your friend so-and-so to help you with that? or the facilitator can model how to use Stephen's communication system, modeling not only for Stephen, but also for the peers on how to use the system when talking to Stephen. And this was, sorry, it's a little blurry because I had to blow it up so big. But this was the video team that we saw planning. This is what they were working on after they did their classroom planning forum. Once the team went through both processes, as Harold said, you don't have to use all these forms, but it is a process, and some of them are good. I like using them all, but you can't use them all at one time. So we did ask the team, what do you think of these forms? Are they helpful? Is there a better way, or how do you see using these? And this is very short, maybe just under a minute. I hope you can hear it. Let me know if you can't. Oops.
As we used this one to help answer this one, once we had it, we worked out a plan here and then we put it on this paper. I think either combining them, or if you start with this one and then the next meeting you have, this is more general for the whole year, and then the next meeting before each unit, start and do specific with this, or for each particular project or big thing we're getting ready to do. What should we break down for each?
Well, and I think the key is for this to be successful is communication between you and I.
And we always stop and talk before school, after school, in the hall. I mean, we found one year we had lunch. But
yeah. Well, and then it's also too, like, we'll shoot each other an email or text message. Right now, she has one of my students in a peer support arrangement, and it's nothing for her to call me and be like, hey, I got a little pickle. What do you think about da-da-da-da? Sounds great.
So I thought they came up with a nice plan for how to use these forms. Taking one to look at the big picture. What does a typical day in this classroom look like? And we can think about the big ideas and how we're going to support specific, general supports that we can use all the time in this type activity, all the time in this type activity. And then taking the peer support plan and making it more specific to the topic, the unit, or the lesson. And that's also where you would start looking at the specifics of your fringe vocabulary that you need for that topic or that lesson. But the classroom activity, the green one in the back, and the set framework are kind of the initial planning for the whole year. So you get an idea of the types of supports and the types of communication supports you're going to need in place before all your activities. And then this gets to those specifics of what types of fringe do we need, what vocabulary do we need, and how will they interact. And that really is the end of our presentation on this. So I'm going to go through a couple slides real quick, and then I want comments about these planning forms, if they're useful, or if there's other ways you can do this, and if you have questions about the communication sides of it. We have the peersupport.org, KentuckyPeerSupport.org website. That's the homepage. And TAALC actually has materials online as well, and it's at the MSD One Stop website, which is up there in blue. Of course, we also have our Google Drive with a lot of our materials. We both have Facebook pages, so if you haven't checked out TAALC or Kentucky Peer Support on Facebook, check them out. There's some really nice things that get posted. A lot of things from Practical AAC on the TAALC website, and a lot on inclusive activities for students on the Peer Support Network.
Luann, if people want copies of the 3 forms, will we send them out to them?
Yeah, usually after we do a webinar, we'll send out certain things, so I can send out the forms. You will also find 2 of the 3 forms we know are on the website. The first, the pre-planning form, I do not believe is in our website, but under resources, you will find the other 2 planning forms, classroom support planning form and peer support planning form.
Okay.
And then we have the references for everything we use today. Any questions, discussion, comments?
Yeah, Luann, could I go back and look at that first pre-planning, the one that you had the animation. I missed part of that because I got distracted and I was looking at it in comparison to the others. The first one you put up, it looks like that, only the very first one you did.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, it's back here.
Sorry.
All right, I should have just ended the this one.
It's not that one either. It's the one before that.
Let me end.
That was the first one.
That is the first one, yeah. This is the first.
There was the one that had a whole. There was one that had a whole bunch of information up at the top about what does the typical peer do. I think there was one before that.
Oh yeah.
It's your pre-planning form. It's your pre-planning one.
Yeah, you're right, Judy. I'm sorry.
Is this showing?
No, I'm still just seeing classroom planning. There, that's it.
Yeah, that was the first one you covered.
That's the one I was trying to look at. I just wanted to look at it a little bit more if I could.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, I think that one is really useful. Just as a general way of looking at things, I really like that, and I wanted to look at it again. Thank you.
You're welcome. And this one is the one we do not have on our website, but Patty and I have talked about finding it, because we got one from Eric Carter, finding it and getting it put on our website as well.
Yeah.
Write that one
And
down.
can we also send this out to everybody too?
Okay. We'll send out all three to everyone. Should I send out the set framework blank as well?
You certainly can. It's and the set framework that that TAALC uses is adapted from can't remember. I'm going to have to remember, and I'm not going to. So it's a cast.
Isn't it Joy Zabala's? Yeah, Joy Zabala at cast.
Yeah.
But yeah, we can put it on the Google Drive.
Okay. We'll do that.
You know, all of them are very matrix oriented. So, you know, what's the routine? What interactions go on? What supports? What does the student need to be able to do? And what supports do we need to put in place? Are kind of the key ideas. Is that right? Would you say that's right?
Yeah, it's the process that is really important to go through, and to use something to write down that.
And also to use that as the basis for training peers on specific strategies that they can use to engage the student in both communication as well as in more specific academic tasks in the class.
And to inform whatever adult is facilitating that group, whether it's the general ed teacher, paraprofessional, or the special ed teacher. It also helps really focus in on how can I help facilitate.
And you know, and trying to choose which one you would use. Certainly, if communication and social interaction is the primary need, I can see why Dr. Page really likes that first form, because that's what that first form addresses. The second and third forms address interactions and more of a focus around the formats of the class and the content of the class. So if that's the higher priority, I would go to the second or the third. But absolutely, it's thinking through the process and using it to assist paraprofessionals as well as students to interact with each other is the whole key why this should be done.
Any questions or comments from our participants? I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everybody.
There was a person, and I forgot who it was, mentioned, and maybe it was Miss Abbott, mentioned that the students are participating in science, but there's not a lot of interaction with the other students.
Yes, that was me.
And I'm thinking, that first forum might be a really good way of thinking through that with the general ed teacher, and and then looking, okay, what are some specific things that we can do, and work with the student and the peers to increase those interactions.
I think that's a good idea, and I will go talk to her because she's very receptive.
Yeah.
So that's on my side right there too. And I got a specific student in mind that is verbal and is able to take in some content.
Right. Okay. So, and I think to me it's use something. Okay, we know that, you will get kids thrown in together, but you'll get them physically present, but not necessarily anything else. So that's why this individualized planning is so important.
Well, it is 5 o'clock. It's actually like 5:03, 5:04. So I appreciate everybody joining us today and sticking with us. If you have any questions, you email us and
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great, Luann. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
bye.
Bye-bye.
If you have any topics, let me know.
And we'll get the planning forms out to you.